Now I will introduce myself. I'm the next speaker. My name is Angela Quiros, and I'm interested in the links between terrestrial and marine protection at the coast. And this is a project in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of the Philippines. So our planet is blessed with biodiversity evolving over hundreds of millions of years, but we're losing this through extinction and intensive massive range and population size reductions. Protected areas are the most widespread, heavily invested tool, perhaps the oldest and most established intervention to prevent this biodiversity loss. It reduces habitat loss and mortality from harvesting. Marine protected areas are also distinct areas set aside that restrict human activity. They deal with habitat destruction and fisheries management. However, historically, marine protected areas have lagged behind terrestrial protected areas in the area protected. And there's another problem here. Protected areas don't exist in a vacuum. There's Dan Jansen's eternal external threat. And basically what it is that there's movement of animals and seeds outside protected areas, and there's movement of people inside a protected area. However, in the terrestrial realm, you can buffer against these effects with fences, hard boundaries. You could also protect entire watersheds. The problem of the external threat is even worse in marine protected areas. They have porous borders, there's flow from land to sea, such as sediment, nutrients, carbon, contaminants. This coastal ecotone is important in the transfer of organic and inorganic material between terrestrial marine systems. And these coastlines house 60% of the world's population. Over 400 million people worldwide live near the borders of protected areas. 83% of MPAs are highly impacted by humans, while 95% of TPAs, or terrestrial protected areas, are highly impacted by humans. And while there is ongoing biodiversity loss, terrestrial protected areas have been cited independently of marine protected areas. And when citing marine protected areas, folks have considered integrated coastal and ocean management. They try to link terrestrial marine conservation planning or conservation planning for connectivity. But these are plans and these are models, and there's not much empirical data out there to measure this. So if there is a paper that could inspire a project, this is it, Integrated Coastal Reserve Planning, where they ask the question, do you have benefits where you, or synergies when you link terrestrial and marine protected areas? I chose to study this in seagrasses. They measure changes in the nearshore environment. They're foundational species, and they provide important fisheries links. And this project was also inspired close to home by long-term data, Seagrass net in Malaysia, where here on the y-axis you have percent cover seagrass. And on the left, we have seagrass in an MPA, and on the right, seagrasses outside the MPA, but we see that the pattern is the same. There is actually loss of the seagrass, and this is due to a sediment plume from deforestation. And so basically, the point of this is that marine protected areas did not protect these seagrass beds from loss. And, well, we've seen this map a lot, but I chose to study in my home country, the Philippines. But we have to keep in mind that there are over 100 million people living in the Philippines, and half of all Philippine municipalities range over 20,000 miles of coastline, or much of the population relies on coastal resources for food and income. So in the Philippines, I surveyed 33 islands in 10 regions and 54 seagrass beds. And this Herculean task could not have been done if it weren't for a team of UC Santa Cruz and Filipino university students. And we were supported by local governments and businesses and nonprofits in each of these regions. And in each of these regions, I looked at seagrass beds in these four types of, different types of reserve design. I asked the question, how does reserve design modify these environmental impacts on seagrass conditions? So for example, you have a seagrass bed next to a terrestrial protected area in an MPA. Next, you have a seagrass bed that was not protected, but next to a terrestrial protected area, and so on and so forth. So this is the model I'll be using. I hypothesized that protection status had an indirect effect on seagrass biological response, while protection status had a direct effect on seagrass, on environmental response in seagrass beds. And the environment had a direct effect on the seagrass biological response. In other words, the effects of protection on seagrass condition were mediated by the environmental response in the bed. So first, I looked at protection status. And so terrestrial protection is actually ill-defined in the Philippines. I could not locate enough coastal terrestrial protected areas. So what I had to do was get a proxy for terrestrial protection. And basically, I did a land use analysis. And so in this proxy, terrestrial protection is effectively controlling for and minimizing certain land use types. In this model, land use was a continuous variable. So to do this, I obtained satellite imagery of the watershed and adjacent coastlines of each seagrass bed. And I heads down digitized each of these 54 watersheds. And I looked at different land uses such as bare ground, so this is deforested areas, human development, roads, houses, farmland, aquaculture, and vegetation. So next I look at the environmental response, and I collected environmental characteristics and sediment characteristics. Sediment characteristics included fine sand, silt, terrestrial material, and organic material in the sediment. I also took environmental responses. Lastly, I measured seagrass biological response. And basically, this is on the meadow level, seagrass abundance and diversity. I took a suite of abundance and diversity parameters, such as percent cover, canopy height, shoot density. And it was, I summed everything up except for Enhalis, which has a different story to tell. As we know, Enhalis, slow growing, has a lot of below ground biomass. So in this model, marine protection was a binary model, basically if the seagrass bed was in an MPA or not. However, terrestrial protection was actually an area covered, covered by the different land uses. And to do this analysis, I had two steps. The first step was a canonical correlation analysis where I looked at the effect of terrestrial protection on environmental and biological variables. So just a little review on this. CCA looks at equations that maximizes correlation between two sets of variables. And here we have biological and environment. And it's similar to a multiple regression, but there are multiple intercorrelated outcome variables, such as here you have plant growth and sun. And so this is a makeup CCA graph where as plant growth increases, as you have more sunlight, you have more plant growth. But because there's different variables measured here, you could also have leaf size, which would be down here, so larger leaves, less sunlight, larger leaves. And for this thing, for this model, this is what I inputted in here: the terrestrial protection status, environmental response, and biological response. So here in this graph, I just want to show you the areas in this graph where I will start plotting seagrass beds. So I told you that I collected a bunch of variables in each of these 54 seagrass beds. And so in the end, we just come out with one value, one dot per bed. And here, beds in this area are in good condition. And what do I mean by good condition? They could have high seagrass species diversity. This is Philippines. These are multi-species beds. Seagrass beds in not so good condition had low seagrass species diversity. Next, we look at the environmental variables. Here on the left-hand side, we had environmental variables that were associated with terrestrial protection. And on the right, environmental variables that were associated with non-protected terrestrial areas. So for example, what were these? Here you have high visibility was associated with terrestrial protection, and low visibility, unprotected terrestrial areas. And when you graph everything, this is 1 point for each of the seagrass beds. We had strong, significant negative relationship between these biological and environmental variables. And I will only talk about the first canonical correlation. So basically, beds here were in good condition, and they were associated with high visibility. Next, these beds were considered like in poor condition, and you had higher canopy height of anthropogenic. Basically, with the lower visibility, you had beds that were only made up of anthropogenic or maybe another species, and we also had watersheds that were larger. We had high areas of deforestation, high areas of farmland and aquaculture, and higher sediment organic matter. So to sum this up, we had beds with high seagrass species diversity, had high visibility, and were associated with coastal terrestrial protected areas. And this is a converse. Beds with low seagrass species diversity and higher anthropogenic canopy height were associated with low visibility, high sediment organic matter, and these large areas of bare ground, aquaculture, and larger watersheds. Next, we wanted to see the effect of marine protected areas on these variables. And so basically, an ANCOVA looks at covariates to see if the relationship between environmental and biological variables varied as a function of whether you were in an MPA or not. So to do this, I plotted half of the sites in red. These are the seagrass sites in MPAs. And what the ANCOVA does is test for the differences in slopes. And so when you plot the seagrass beds that weren't in MPAs, ANCOVA tested no difference in slopes, either presence or absence of MPAs, small or large, old and new. How do we translate this to science? Well, if you have a limited amount of funding and had to choose to protect seagrass beds, you would choose to just have coastal terrestrial protected areas. And actually, this reminds me of Johan Ekblom's talk earlier about the site conditions were very important, influencing the seagrass condition, and also the fact that diversity is important. And so to sum it up, terrestrial protection, or the absence of deforestation, farmland, and aquaculture, had indirect positive effects on environmental and biological conditions. Environmental conditions that mattered in this model were visibility and sediment, and biological conditions of the bed were seagrass species diversity and abundance. And so this was funded by a lot of people and a lot of sources and helped by a ton of people. And if anyone has any questions, I have one question. Thank you.
Nice talk, Angela. So they certainly don't appear to be very effective at protecting the seagrass meadows themselves in terms of cover and so on. But presumably these MPAs are set up for fish and other types of communities. Do you have any idea whether they are actually doing that for the fish and so on?
So another story I failed to say was in all of these beds, I did fish surveys and invert surveys, and I believe that has a different story to tell, and I haven't finished working through that data yet. But yes, this is just for the physical biogenic habitat of seagrass.
So it'd be interesting to see whether the processes associated with the consumers actually ameliorate some of those effects, although it doesn't look like they do, according to your data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.